The Sunday morning had begun with that particular serenity St. Mary Mead often enjoyed. A faint mist over the green, the chime of the church bell drifting through the air like a memory. The villagers arrived in slow, orderly fashion, exchanging polite nods and subdued smiles. Hats were adjusted, hymn books tapped against gloved hands, and the air carried the faint scent of rosewater and starch. It was a morning of habit and comfort. Nothing about it suggested that within the hour, the little village would be murmuring about death. The new curate, Reverend Peter Linton, had been a recent addition to St. Mary Mead's small parish. He was a gentle young man, soft-voiced, with a kind of earnest charm that made elderly parishioners call him a dear boy. He had come from Oxford, they said, and there was something scholarly and uncertain about him. Someone not yet hardened by the darker corners of life. Miss Marple, sitting near the back as was her quiet custom, had watched him these last few Sundays with mild interest. He blushed easily, apologized too often, and seemed a little afraid of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. That morning, his sermon had taken an odd turn. He began well enough, speaking on the virtue of honesty, but halfway through his tone faltered. He paused. His hands trembled slightly as he turned a page, and then, without explanation, he said something quite strange. "There are things," he murmured, his voice barely carrying beyond the first few pews, "things that must be spoken, even if it is too late to do any good." A few heads turned. Mrs. Price Ridley raised an eyebrow. The vicar frowned slightly as if to urge him on. But the young man merely closed his Bible with a faint thud and said, "Let us pray." It was, in the opinion of most of the congregation, an unfortunate lapse of confidence. "Nerves," someone whispered as they filed out after the service. "Or perhaps the poor boy's unwell." But there was a peculiar tension in the air, something unspoken beneath the polite chatter about luncheon and weather. Miss Marple, who had remained seated longer than usual, observed the curate as he exited the vestry. He walked quickly, his head bowed, and seemed not to notice that his cassock hem was dragging through the damp leaves. By evening, his name was on everyone's lips, but not for the sermon. The curate had been found collapsed by the old well behind the church, lifeless and cold, his hand still clutching a folded note that no one could quite decipher. The vicar's wife fainted when she heard, and old Mr. Symes, who had been trimming the churchyard hedges, swore he'd seen a figure running away just before the body was discovered. It was a strange sort of tragedy, so unlike the quiet village that even the birds seemed to hush. And though Inspector Craddock from Much Benham was soon to arrive and make his inquiries, it was Miss Marple, her knitting softly clicking in the lamplight, who first murmured, "Poor young man." But what, I wonder, did he mean by too late? The question hung in the air like a secret waiting to be noticed. The next morning dawned pale and still, the mist lying heavy upon the roofs like a veil reluctant to lift. Word of the curate's death had spread faster than the tolling of the church bell. By breakfast time, the postmistress knew, the butcher knew, and Mrs. Price Ridley was already calling it a dreadful business, with the kind of relish that only true moral panic could provoke. In every kitchen and parlour, theories brewed alongside the tea. Poison, some said. A fall, said others. Though no one could quite explain how a young man in full health might collapse beside a disused well without so much as a cry for help. Miss Marple, however, began her day as usual. She arranged her violets in a small glass vase, fed the canary, and only after her toast did she allow herself to ponder what had happened. She knew that the well behind the church was dangerous ground, overgrown, forgotten, and avoided by children since the accident years ago. So what business had Reverend Linton there at dusk, and why the note clutched so tightly in his hand? Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham just before 10, his motor car stirring the village dust like a herald of consequence. He was greeted by the vicar, Reverend Clement, whose eyes were hollow from lack of sleep. "It's unthinkable," the vicar muttered as they entered his study. Such a gentle soul. He had no enemies, none that I know of. Craddock's notebook snapped open. Enemies are seldom obvious, sir, he said dryly. Now this note, where is it? The vicar handed it over with visible reluctance. The paper was damp and creased, the ink smeared but still legible in parts. Craddock frowned as he read aloud the decipherable words. Truth, unforgiven. The letter must not tell her. Too late. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage shortly after, ostensibly to deliver a jar of marmalade, her customary offering in times of distress. Such a terrible thing, she said softly, hands folded over her basket. One wonders what could trouble a young man so dreadfully as to seek solitude at night. Craddock looked up, half amused. You do have a way of appearing at the right moment, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Oh dear me, I hardly think any moment is right for tragedy, but sometimes the human heart cannot bear silence. The inspector, recognizing wisdom when he heard it, decided to indulge her. You knew him then? Only as one knows a curate, she said. Polite conversation after service, a kind word for the elderly. Yet there was something restless about him, as if his mind were never quite in step with his duty. Craddock made a note of that, and after a moment's hesitation, invited her to accompany him to the churchyard. The scene was still guarded, the constable keeping idle, villagers from creeping too near. The curate's body had been taken away, but traces of the night remained. The trampled grass, the scuff of shoes in the mud, and near the edge of the well, a small crushed posy of white wildflowers. Miss Marple stooped delicately, her eyes softening. Primroses, she murmured. Unusual for October. Someone must have picked them earlier and dropped them here. Or the wind carried them, the constable offered. Possibly, Miss Marple said, though her tone carried a quiet doubt. But flowers do not travel uphill without purpose, constable, especially not in the dark. Back in the village, tongues wagged with enthusiasm unchecked. Mrs. Bantry told her maid that she'd heard the curate was engaged to a lady from London, though no one could produce her name. Old Mr. Symes, questioned by the police, insisted he'd seen a figure in dark clothing moving through the trees near the rectory. Yet when pressed, he admitted it might have been the vicar himself. Everyone looks the same by lantern light, he said defensively, and I wasn't about to go chasing phantoms. By afternoon, a thin drizzle had begun to fall, softening the outlines of the village. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, knitting untouched upon her lap, her thoughts turning over the fragments she'd gathered. A sermon on truth, a trembling voice, a note of regret, a handful of primroses by a forgotten well. It was not coincidence, she felt. It was confession, interrupted. Her reverie was broken by a knock. It was Mrs. Clement, pale and agitated. Jane, I had to come, she whispered. Peter was upset yesterday. He'd received a letter, something that frightened him. My husband thought it best not to pry, but now... She hesitated, twisting her gloves. Now I think it might matter. Miss Marple guided her gently to the fire. Tell me exactly what you remember, dear. Mrs. Clement took a breath. The post came late. Peter opened one envelope, and his face just changed. I asked if it was bad news, and he said, no, only something long forgotten. Then he went out, said he needed air. Miss Marple listened carefully. Do you still have the envelope? Yes. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. She reached into her handbag and produced a torn bit of paper, faintly marked with a return address. Miss Marple examined it by the firelight, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Interesting, she murmured. No name. Only a postmark. Much Benham. At that moment, the clock struck 5, and the sound carried through the rain-soaked evening like a reminder. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and returned it to Mrs. Clement's trembling hands. Keep this safe, she said gently, and say nothing to your husband just yet. There's no use stirring fear before we have something solid. People, you know, can be dreadfully quick to draw the wrong conclusion. When Mrs. Clement left, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting now forgotten altogether. Her mind was moving through quiet corridors of thought, assembling the human puzzle piece by piece. Somewhere in that letter lay the reason a young man had spoken of truth and forgiveness, and why someone else, perhaps listening unseen, had decided he would never speak again. Outside, the rain fell heavier, tapping against the glass like restless fingers. Miss Marple glanced once toward the church tower rising through the mist and whispered softly to herself, too late for him, perhaps, but not for the truth. The following morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the village washed and silent under a sky the color of old pewter. St. Mary Mead had that peculiar stillness which often follows calamity, the kind that makes footsteps sound too loud and whispers travel too far. Inspector Craddock had already returned to the vicarage, determined to begin proper interviews. The inquest was scheduled for the end of the week, and he meant to have a full picture before then. Yet something about this case, he confessed to Sergeant Lake, refused to settle neatly. It was not quite suicide, nor could it be explained by chance. There was intent, but hidden beneath a veil of gentility. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was on her way to the grocer's, a basket looped over her arm, her manner as unhurried as ever. She paused, as if by happenstance, when she saw Mr. Symes trimming the church hedge once again. "Good morning, Mr. Symes," she said pleasantly. "A sad business, all this. You must have had quite a fright." The man, a wiry figure with more wrinkles than expressions, straightened up, wiping his shears on his trousers. "That I did, Miss Marple. Never thought I'd see such a thing. Him lying there like a broken doll. A good lad he was, always polite." "Did you notice anything unusual before it happened?" she asked softly. "Any visitors at the church? Any sounds that seemed out of place?" Symes scratched his head. "Now that you mention it, there was someone come by on Friday evening. I thought it queer, that time of night. A woman, I think, slim, with one of those modern hats. But she moved quick and I didn't see her face." "A woman," Miss Marple repeated, as if testing the word. "Did she go into the vestry?" "No, miss, not that I saw. She came round the path by the old well. I was just locking the gate then, so I didn't linger." "Quite right," Miss Marple said approvingly. "It's never wise to interfere when one doesn't know the whole story. Still, you have a good memory, Mr. Symes. Such little things, you know, often turn out to be not so little after all." By noon, she found herself at the post office, where Miss Hartnell was arranging envelopes with the precision of a general plotting a campaign. The talk, inevitably, had circled back to the curate. "Between you and me," Miss Hartnell said in a conspiratorial tone, "I've heard he had debts, terrible ones. That sort of thing can drive a man to rashness." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Debts are dreadful, yes, but they seldom make a man look peaceful when found. I imagine he was troubled by something rather more personal." Miss Hartnell blinked, then lowered her voice further. "Well, there was that business of the letter, the postmark, Much Benham, and just last week a lady's envelope went missing. Came through this office, I swear it did. But it never reached the vicarage. Addressed in a fine hand, too." "Missing?" said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "How unfortunate, and you've no idea who sent it?" "None," Miss Hartnell said. "But I'll tell you this, it wasn't a tradesman's bill. The paper was the good kind, thick and scented. Lavender, if I'm not mistaken." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and walked home through the lanes, the faint scent of wet leaves clinging to her clothes. She thought about the curate's trembling hands, the unspoken confession, the primroses left like an offering. And now, a woman in the churchyard, a letter that vanished, a note about truth and forgiveness. Her thoughts moved in quiet circles, connecting threads as gently as one might tie lace. When she reached her gate, she found Inspector Craddock waiting, hat in hand, looking distinctly unsettled. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. I was hoping to find you. We've had developments. The pathologist's report came in. There was nothing in the young man's system. No poison, no blow to the head. Death was caused by shock. Cardiac failure, they think. Strange for someone his age, she murmured. Exactly. And there's something else. We've found out who wrote to him. The letter came from a Mrs. Lydia Carew of Much Benham, widow of the late Colonel Carew. You may recall the name. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with recognition. Indeed I do. Colonel Carew was quite notorious for his temper. I recall a small scandal, though it was hushed up. Something to do with a servant girl. Craddock nodded grimly. You remember correctly. The girl disappeared soon after, never found. Now, according to Mrs. Carew, young Linton once served in the Colonel's household as a tutor to their nephew. She says she wrote to ask him to keep quiet about certain family matters. Miss Marple's knitting hands paused mid-air. Ah, she said softly. Then the letter wasn't meant to reopen the past. It was meant to keep it buried. Craddock sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It seems so. But what I can't fathom is why the boy went near that well. There's no reason for him to be there. Unless... He looked up at her. Unless he was meeting someone, Miss Marple finished quietly. And if that someone knew he intended to tell the truth, it would have been most inconvenient for them indeed. She rose, moving toward the window where the last of the rain still clung to the glass. You see, Inspector, human beings are very rarely driven to evil by wickedness alone. It's usually fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of loss, fear of being seen for what they are. Perhaps our curate, poor soul, saw something once that was never meant to be seen again, and someone, fearing that truth, chose silence as the safer path. Craddock regarded her for a long moment. You think he was frightened to death? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that the human conscience is quite capable of killing. One only has to know where to look for the wound. Outside, the church bell began to toll for evening service. Its mournful sound drifted through the village like an echo of unfinished prayers. Craddock closed his notebook and stepped into the fading light, but Miss Marple remained by the window, her eyes fixed on the path leading to the churchyard. Somewhere between the living and the dead, between guilt and grace, she felt the faint pulse of the truth. Still hidden, but not for long. That evening, as dusk deepened over St. Mary Mead, the lamp-lighters made their slow, methodical way along the high street. Their faint halos of light trembled in the damp air, barely pushing back the darkness. Inside her sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, her needles idle in her lap. The church bell had finished tolling, yet its echo seemed to linger. There was something in that sound, a soft insistence, as though the village itself held its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. Her mind retraced the day's conversations with the precision of habit. Mrs. Clement's trembling account, the Much Benham postmark, the unseen woman in the churchyard, and that letter from Lydia Carew. It all spoke of something old, festering beneath the calm surface of propriety. She thought of Reverend Linton's words in the pulpit, things that must be spoken even if it is too late to do any good. It had been a confession in disguise, but whose sin had he meant to reveal? His own, or another's? A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock again, hat in hand, his expression more tired than before. Forgive me, Miss Marple, he said, stepping in. We've just had a telegram from Much Benham. Mrs. Carew is dead. Miss Marple's blue eyes lifted sharply. Dead? He nodded grimly. This afternoon. Heart failure, according to her maid. She was found in her drawing room beside an open fire, a brandy glass in her hand. The doctor insists it was natural, but the timing, too convenient for my liking. Miss Marple folded her hands, her gaze thoughtful. You are quite right to be uneasy, Inspector. Death, you know, has a curious way of following secrets once they begin to stir. Did she leave anything? Letters? Papers? Nothing useful. But the maid says she'd been agitated all morning. Apparently, a visitor came just after breakfast. A woman, no name given, described as quiet, well-dressed, middle-aged. Left no calling card. Miss Marple's knitting resumed with slow, deliberate rhythm. "I see," she murmured. And the maid didn't overhear their conversation. "Bits of it," Craddock admitted. "Something about a terrible mistake and the boy's sermon." After that, raised voices, and then silence. The visitor left soon after. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. "A woman again," she said softly. "It appears our mystery lady moves faster than we do." The following morning, Miss Marple visited the churchyard once more, under the pretense of tending the memorial flowers. She moved slowly among the graves, her eyes tracing every detail, the disturbed earth near the well, the faint indentation of a footprint half filled with rainwater. As she bent, she noticed something small glinting in the mud, a broken cufflink, oval-shaped, engraved with a monogram, L.C. She slipped it discreetly into her pocket. When she returned home, she found Mrs. Price Ridley waiting in her garden path, face flushed with self-importance. "My dear Jane," she began breathlessly, "you'll think me fanciful, but I must tell you, last night, just before midnight, I saw a light in the vestry window. A flickering sort of light, like a lantern. No business there at that hour, surely?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, indeed. And you are quite certain it wasn't the reflection of your own lamp?" Mrs. Price Ridley bristled. "My curtains were drawn, Jane. I know what I saw." "Then you've done very well to tell me," Miss Marple said kindly. "Though, of course, one must always be careful how one tells the police such things. They have so little imagination." That evening, Miss Marple sent a short note to Inspector Craddock, requesting he meet her at the church after dusk. When he arrived, she was already there, her small figure barely visible in the shadow of the vestry door. "I thought we might pay a quiet visit," she said, her tone as calm as if she were discussing the weather. "After all, if someone felt compelled to return here, it's likely for something they left behind." Inside, the air was cold and faintly scented of candle wax. Craddock's torch swept across the pews, the lectern, the altar rail. Nothing seemed disturbed. Then Miss Marple's voice, low and steady, came from behind him. "There," she said, "near the window." He turned his light and saw a scrap of charred paper on the floor. It was a corner torn from a letter, the handwriting delicate and unmistakably feminine. Only a few words survived. "Cannot live with what was done. Truth buried. Well." Craddock exhaled slowly. "That settles it. Someone came here to destroy evidence." Miss Marple nodded. "Or perhaps to silence a memory. It is very hard, Inspector, for some people to live with guilt that isn't their own, especially women, when they have protected men they should not have." He frowned. "You think Mrs. Caro's death and the curate's are connected?" "Oh, indubitably. And I believe there's one more piece to find. Something, or someone, both knew about the well. That place has witnessed more than one tragedy, I fancy." The church door creaked suddenly, and both turned sharply. A figure stood in the entrance, illuminated by the faint moonlight. Mrs. Clement. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw your note, Jane," she whispered. "I had to come. There's something I must tell you, something dreadful. Peter came to me 2 days before he died. He said he'd found a letter among the church archives. An old one, hidden inside a hymn book. It mentioned the name Caro and something about a girl who vanished. He said he couldn't bear to keep it secret any longer." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle. "And did he show it to you?" Mrs. Clement shook her head. "He said he would the next day, but he never came." Craddock exchanged a look with Miss Marple, his jaw tightening. "Then the letter's still here somewhere," he said. "Unless our midnight visitor took it." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes were keen. "Yes," she said quietly. "And that, I think, is why our curate was found beside the well, because the truth he sought to speak was buried there long before he ever arrived." Outside, the wind stirred through the yews, whispering softly over the stones. The church clock struck the half-hour, echoing through the nave like a solemn heartbeat. Miss Marple stood in silence, the faint glimmer of understanding forming behind her eyes. A pattern taking shape. Somewhere in that long-buried scandal lay the answer, and someone in the village still feared its resurrection. And as she turned toward the shadowed pews, she murmured, "It isn't over yet." The church seemed to hold its breath long after Mrs. Clement's frightened confession. The shadows from the candlelight trembled along the stone walls as if the past itself were stirring. Inspector Craddock stood very still, his hand resting on the edge of the pulpit, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple, who remained thoughtful and still as a portrait. "If the letter truly existed," he said at last, "someone went to great lengths to remove it. The question is, who knew it was hidden?" Miss Marple's voice came soft but firm. "Someone who feared its discovery, and that person, Inspector, may not have been among strangers." Mrs. Clement's composure began to waver. "You mean one of us?" she whispered. "But everyone loved Peter." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "Love can coexist with fear, my dear. People have been known to destroy what they love most, simply to keep their world intact." The vicar's wife turned away, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. Craddock, who had learned to trust Miss Marple's quiet reasoning, gave a short nod. "We'll search the archives again tomorrow, properly this time. If there's a trace of that letter, we'll find it." As the three of them stepped out into the cold air, the churchyard lay shrouded in fog. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The sound seemed to echo against the gravestones like a warning. Miss Marple tightened her shawl and said gently, "Be careful, Inspector. When a secret begins to unearth itself, it tends to take others with it." The following day brought a hard frost that glazed the fields white. St. Mary Mead looked deceptively tranquil, but gossip was spreading like fire through dry straw. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that the curate's ghost had been seen wandering by the lich gate. Mr. Symes swore someone had moved the stones near the well overnight. Miss Hartnell was certain that the vicarage maid had been crying. Proof, she said, that the poor girl knew something. Inspector Craddock arrived early at the church with 2 constables and began a meticulous search of the vestry and adjoining storeroom. The records, kept in neat leather-bound volumes, were lifted one by one, their dust dancing in the cold light. Nothing seemed amiss until a constable called out softly, "Sir, there's something here." He was kneeling by the hymn-book shelf, where the lower boards showed signs of being pried loose. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a small bundle of letters. Craddock unwrapped them carefully, his breath misting in the air. 3 in total, he said, all written in the same hand. This one's dated 20 years ago. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint but legible. The first letter was from a young girl, simple, pleading words about a promise broken and a life ruined. The second, in a firmer hand, warned her to leave the county. The third was unsigned, containing only one sentence: "If the truth is told, it will destroy us all." Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly near the font, stepped forward. "May I?" she asked. Craddock handed her the letters, and she studied them closely. "Poor child," she murmured. "This confirms it. The missing servant, the one connected to the Carrows. I remember the whispers, the colonel's temper, the girl's sudden departure, and the convenient silence that followed. It wasn't a disappearance at all. It was a cover-up." "But who kept these?" Craddock asked. "Surely not the curate." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone before him. perhaps one of the previous vicars, who found them and couldn't quite bring himself to destroy them. They were hidden here, waiting for someone with too much conscience and too little caution to find them. That someone was young Linton. Craddock rubbed his chin. And when he spoke of telling the truth, he meant this, Miss Marple finished. He must have confronted someone connected to the old scandal, someone who had everything to lose if it came out. They left the church in silence, the letters sealed again in their envelope. The inspector walked Miss Marple home, his thoughts heavy. If Mrs. Carrow wanted this kept quiet, she might have panicked. But she's dead now, which leaves our mysterious visitor. Yes, Miss Marple said. A woman still living in the village, perhaps. Someone who once had a reason to protect the Colonel's name, or her own. As they reached her garden gate, Miss Marple paused, glancing toward the vicarage across the green. You see, Inspector, guilt has a peculiar way of reshaping itself over the years. It may change hands, pass from one person to another, but it never quite disappears. It lingers, like frost on the grass, invisible until the morning sun finds it. That afternoon, Craddock went to question Mrs. Clement again, but she was too distraught to speak coherently. The vicar himself seemed shaken. My wife has taken this terribly to heart, he said. She insists Peter came to her for guidance and that she failed him. Craddock, noticing the man's trembling hands, asked quietly, Did you know about the Carrow affair? The vicar hesitated before nodding. I did. My predecessor confided in me once. He said there were things better left buried, quite literally. I thought it a figure of speech. That evening, as dusk fell once more, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, a single candle burning beside her. The broken cufflink lay before her, gleaming faintly. She turned it over, tracing the initials with one thin finger. L.C. Not Lydia Carrow, she murmured. Lydia's gone. Then who? Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the vicarage lights glowed faintly through the mist. Louisa Clement, she whispered. L.C. The name hung in the air like a bell tolling faintly through the fog. She rose, her expression unreadable, and moved toward the door, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her garden gate, the truth waited, quiet, patient, and merciless. The night was windless, the air heavy with the kind of silence that seems to listen back. Miss Marple crossed the narrow lane to the vicarage, her small figure moving briskly, the cold biting through her shawl. The lamps in the study window were still burning. She could see Reverend Clement pacing, his tall shadow moving restlessly against the curtains. When he opened the door, surprise flickered across his face. Miss Marple, at this hour? I am afraid it cannot wait, she said gently. There are matters best faced before they grow darker still. He hesitated but stepped aside, motioning her toward the warmth of the sitting room. The fire burned low, casting a faint glow over the shelves of theology and the small framed photographs upon the mantel. Mrs. Clement was there too, seated rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression more weary than afraid. Louisa, Miss Marple said softly, taking a chair opposite her, you have been most distressed since the curate's death. I cannot help but think that it was not merely grief. It was guilt. Mrs. Clement's lips trembled. I don't know what you mean. Perhaps not in words, Miss Marple continued, her tone kind but unwavering, but I believe you have been carrying the burden of something. Something that began long before Peter Linton ever came to St. Mary Mead. You knew the Carrows once, didn't you? The woman's composure cracked. Her hands flew to her face. Oh, God, help me, she whispered. Yes, I knew them. Reverend Clement turned sharply. Louisa? She looked at him with eyes that seemed to have aged 10 years in a moment. Before we married Henry, I was in service at Much Benham. I worked for the Carrows. The Colonel, he was cruel. Everyone knew it. But Mrs. Carrow, she wasn't wicked. just frightened. She had a son then, only a baby. And there was a girl, Elsie Merton, sweet, foolish, too trusting. She caught the Colonel's eye. When she disappeared, everyone whispered she'd run away. But I knew better. I saw the blood on his sleeve that night, and the next morning the well behind the house was boarded over. Miss Marple's face remained calm, but her eyes grew grave. So the story was true, and the letters we found were written by that poor girl. Louisa nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. She begged Mrs. Carrow to help her. I carried one of those letters myself, but Mrs. Carrow told me to burn it. I couldn't. I hid it in a hymn book when I came here to work under Reverend Hughes. I thought, if the truth ever needed to be known, someone might find it. And someone did. Peter. Reverend Clement sank into his chair, his face pale. Good Lord. Louisa, why didn't you tell me? I was afraid, she said hoarsely. Afraid it would destroy you too. When Peter showed me the letter, I begged him to leave it alone. He said he couldn't, that God's forgiveness couldn't rest on silence. He went to see Mrs. Carrow. She must have panicked. I think she sent someone to meet him that night. He wasn't meant to die, but she wasn't the one who struck him. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Then who did? Louisa looked toward her husband, then down at her folded hands. I followed him, she said. I couldn't let him speak, not after all these years of quiet. When he reached the well, I called out. He turned, startled. There was no struggle. His heart. He simply fell. I knelt beside him, tried to rouse him, but he was gone, and I couldn't bear for anyone to know I'd been there. I dropped the cufflink when I tried to lift him. It was my husband's. He'd lent me his coat that evening. Reverend Clement covered his face with his hands. The silence that followed was unbearable. The fire hissed softly in the grate, and the old clock ticked with painful precision. Miss Marple rose, her expression sorrowful yet composed. Guilt is a quiet thing, Mrs. Clement, she said gently. It doesn't always come with malice, only fear. But the truth was bound to find its way to the surface, just as the well cannot keep its water hidden forever. I shall speak to Inspector Craddock. He must hear this from you. Louisa shook her head wildly. No, Jane, please. My husband, the parish, this would ruin everything. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but did not waver. My dear, concealment ruins more than confession ever could. You have borne this burden alone for far too long. Reverend Clement lifted his head slowly, his voice hollow. She's right, Louisa. Let it end now, for Peter's sake, and for yours. The woman bowed her head in surrender, her shoulders trembling as though some great invisible weight had slipped at last. Outside, the frost was thick upon the grass, and dawn was still hours away. When Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after midnight, he found Miss Marple waiting by the vicarage gate. Her shawl fluttered in the cold wind. She's inside, she told him softly. You'll find her ready to tell the truth. It was not murder in intent, but in consequence. And there is a difference, though not in sorrow. Craddock removed his hat, his expression solemn. You were right again, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. No, Inspector. I only listened to the silence between words. People tell their secrets, you know, long before they mean to. As he entered the vicarage, Miss Marple turned once more toward the church tower, where the mist curled like breath against the dawn. The truth had risen at last, slow and dreadful, like something drawn up from the depth of the well itself. And for a moment the village seemed utterly still, waiting, perhaps, for the morning bells to break the silence and bring the world, reluctantly, back to its peace. The morning after Louisa Clement's confession broke over St. Mary Mead with the pale indifference of a sky that had seen too much. Frost lingered on the hedges, and a faint mist hovered over the churchyard, softening the edges of the gravestones. The village, for all its gossip and curiosity, moved quietly that morning, as though it knew something had shifted beneath its tranquil rhythm. Miss Marple watched from her window, her tea untouched, her gaze fixed on the vicarage across the green. The curtains in the study were drawn now. A police car stood outside, and Inspector Craddock was speaking softly with Reverend Clement, whose face had the color of paper. By mid-morning, Louisa had been taken away, not in handcuffs, but gently, under Craddock's word that she was helping with the inquiry. There was no public humiliation, no parade of whispers along the lane, only a solemn stillness, as if even the gossiping tongues of St. Mary Mead had lost their appetite. Yet Miss Marple knew the village mind. By nightfall, sympathy and suspicion would trade places like two old maids passing in a corridor. It was human nature, inevitable and merciless. Craddock stopped by her cottage later that afternoon, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He looked less like a policeman and more like a man burdened by something heavy he could neither condemn nor forgive. "It's a sad business, Miss Marple," he said quietly, sitting at her table while she poured him tea. "She's admitted everything, the concealment, the meeting, the accident. But it doesn't quite sit right. There are gaps, things she couldn't have known." Miss Marple set down the teapot. "Ah," she murmured. "So the truth, even confessed, still refuses to behave itself." He nodded. "Exactly. She claims the curate collapsed without a word, but the pathologist found bruising on his shoulder. Light, but recent. As if someone seized him in panic or tried to stop him from falling. And there's something else. The letters from the church archive. One is missing." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Missing? You're certain?" "Yes. 3 were found. There should have been 4. The numbers don't match the old parish ledger's record." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And one more thing. The postmistress swears she saw Mrs. Price Ridley post a letter to Much Benham 3 days before the curate's death. She remembers it because the envelope bore a black wax seal. A rare sort of thing nowadays. Said it struck her as funeralish." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but a quiet light came into her eyes. "A black seal," she repeated softly. "Yes, that would be like Mrs. Price Ridley, old-fashioned and dramatic in her moral indignation. The Carrows were gentry once, and she prides herself on remembering every social boundary. It may be she thought herself performing a duty." Craddock frowned. "You think she sent the letter that frightened the curate?" Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "I think she may have stirred a pot that had long since cooled, and found herself scalded in the process." That evening, as twilight sank into the hedgerows, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Price Ridley, who greeted her with the bristling self-importance of one conscious of having information others desired. Her parlor smelled of lavender and mothballs, and her expression carried that blend of righteousness and regret so often found in those who meddle with conviction. "My dear Jane," she said, motioning her guest to a stiff chair, "I hardly know what to say. This whole affair, so shocking, and yet not entirely unexpected. Weak men often meet dramatic ends." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. Yet it's curious, isn't it, how drama seems to follow only where secrets fester. You were acquainted with the Carrows, I believe?" "Acquainted?" Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Barely. One doesn't acquaint oneself with people of that sort, though I did once warn poor Mrs. Carrow. Too lenient with her staff. Far too lenient. And now look where it led her." Miss Marple's eyes softened, the smile unchanged. "And I dare say you also warned our curate, didn't you? Out of kindness, of course. You must have known something of the family scandal." Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened. "I beg your pardon." "Oh, my dear," said Miss Marple, her tone gentle, "there's no harm in meaning well. You thought to spare him from entangling himself in the past. You wrote to Mrs. Carrow, didn't you, to alert her that he intended to speak?" There was a pause. long, sharp and trembling. Then Mrs. Price Ridley's voice faltered. "I only meant to do what was right. The boy was prying into things that should have stayed buried. I thought she ought to know. I thought she could stop him." Miss Marple's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "And she did. But you see, my dear, the dead are not so easily appeased. When one disturbs a grave, something always rises that cannot be put back." Mrs. Price Ridley's face blanched, her lips trembling as she clutched at her lace collar. You make it sound as if I killed him." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "You only opened the door." When Miss Marple left the house, the village green was cloaked in fog. A light burned in the church tower, the bell rope swaying gently in the draught. She paused beneath the yews, her mind piecing together the final pattern, the letter that summoned fear, the woman who carried old guilt, and another who fanned it unwittingly into ruin. Reverend Linton had sought truth. Mrs. Carow had sought silence. Louisa Clement had sought peace, and Mrs. Price Ridley, ever vigilant, had brought the past to life again. As Miss Marple crossed back toward her cottage, she glanced once toward the dark mouth of the well, half concealed behind the churchyard hedge. The frost glistened on its stones like tears. "Yes," she murmured softly into the cold air, "the truth does rise, always, whether one wills it or not." Inside her little parlor, the clock struck 8. She removed her shawl, sat down, and resumed her knitting, though her eyes were far away. Outside, the wind shifted through the lanes, carrying with it the faint toll of the evening bell, a sound that seemed to echo, not through stone, but through memory itself. The following morning dawned clear, though the frost still lingered like a quiet echo of the night before. A weak sun filtered through the mist over St. Mary Mead, glinting on the church spire and turning the windows of the vicarage into squares of dull gold. The air felt too still for comfort, as if the entire village held itself suspended between revelation and disbelief. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat at her table, the morning paper folded untouched beside her teacup. Her thoughts were not with headlines, but with the subtle shifts of conscience and consequence that had stirred the heart of the village. Truth had a way of settling unevenly, she mused. Some found relief in it, others ruin. When Inspector Craddock arrived just after breakfast, his face told her he had not slept. "It's over," he said as she opened the door. "Mrs. Clement has given a full statement. She'll likely be charged with manslaughter. The Crown may show mercy." His tone carried neither satisfaction nor triumph, only weariness. "Mrs. Price Ridley has also admitted to sending that letter to Mrs. Carow. She thought she was protecting the church's reputation." He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Protecting it by destroying it, more like." Miss Marple motioned him toward the fire, where the kettle was already murmuring. "And the missing letter?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Found this morning in Mrs. Price Ridley's bureau drawer. She'd kept a copy, as it happens. One must always have evidence when playing the village martyr." He handed her a folded sheet. The paper was creased and faintly perfumed, written in the elaborate hand of one who prided herself on refinement. Miss Marple read the first line aloud. "To Mrs. Carow, forgive my boldness, but I must warn you that your late husband's sin has not been forgotten. The curate means to make it public." She stopped reading and folded the letter again, her expression thoughtful. "So it was that note which stirred the final sequence," she murmured. "A single act of self-righteousness, sent without malice, yet carrying all the weight of the past upon its wings." Craddock sighed heavily. "You make it sound almost poetic, Miss Marple, but it's a wretched business. The poor young man tried to do right and paid for it. The women who feared the truth tried to smother it and paid for it too. And the rest of the village, well, they'll dine on this for years." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Oh, they'll cluck and whisper, yes. But gossip, in its own curious way, is sometimes the conscience of a small place. It keeps the notion of sin alive, even if no one quite names it. People here will forget the facts soon enough, but not the feeling. That lingers. It always does. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the fire. Craddock stared into the flames. "There's something that still puzzles me," he said at last. "You said last night the truth rises whether one wills it or not. But in this case, wasn't it chance? If the curate hadn't found that letter, if Mrs. Price Ridley hadn't meddled, perhaps everything would have stayed buried." Miss Marple poured him tea and looked at him kindly over the rim of her cup. "Chance, my dear Inspector, is merely the disguise. Truth wears when it walks among men. One cannot keep a secret without feeding it, and once fed, it grows, until it finds a way to speak for itself." Craddock gave a small nod, as if he almost believed her. Then, with a tired smile, he rose to go. "You'll forgive me if I say you have an unnerving way of making sense of the most dreadful things." "I only observe what human nature tells me," she replied gently, "and human nature, alas, seldom lies for long." After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly for some time, her thoughts drifting back to the curate's trembling hands in the pulpit, to his strange final words. "There are things that must be spoken, even if it is too late to do any good." She wondered whether he had known, deep down, that the price of honesty would be his life. Or perhaps he had only hoped to set the balance right, unaware that those he sought to free were still prisoners of fear. The young so often believed that truth was a cure, while age knew it was only a mirror. Later that afternoon, she walked through the village, her small figure neat against the wind. At the post office, conversation stopped as she entered, and Miss Hartnell, flustered but eager, hurried to pour her sympathy into the quiet. "Such a dreadful affair, Miss Marple. I always said that curate was too sensitive. Poor Mrs. Clement. One can't blame her, really. These things happen when women bottle up emotions." Miss Marple listened with a polite nod, bought her stamps, and went on her way. She passed the churchyard, pausing by the well, now sealed once more with fresh boards. A small bunch of primroses, wilted but carefully placed, lay beside it. Someone had remembered. Perhaps Mrs. Clement from her cell, or perhaps Reverend Clement himself, trying to reconcile faith with forgiveness. The light was fading when she reached her cottage again. She lit the lamp, drew her curtains, and set her knitting aside unfinished. For a long time she simply sat, listening to the faint rustle of the wind in the hedges and the distant toll of the evening bell. In another house, Louisa Clement was writing her confession by lamplight, her hand unsteady but her words clear. In another, Mrs. Price Ridley sat in self-imposed solitude, her pride trembling under the weight of public silence. The village, outwardly serene, was quietly rearranging itself around the consequences. Life would go on, services, teas, harvest fairs, but something indefinable had changed, like the faint crack in a church window that alters the light forever. Miss Marple rose at last and went to her window. Across the green, the vicarage lights glowed faintly, steadfast against the cold. "Poor souls," she whispered, "all of them trying to mend what was broken by truth, and forgetting that it is not truth that breaks us, but fear." She closed the curtains gently, the sound of the latch soft as a prayer. The clock struck 9. Outside, the village slept, innocent, once more in the fragile way that only those who have seen darkness can manage. And in her small, warm room, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the steady click of her needles the only sound left to mark the passing of the quiet, merciful night. The next day began with a silence that felt almost deliberate, as though St. Mary Mead itself were reluctant to resume its ordinary rhythms. The village green lay untouched under a thin veil of frost, and the air was sharp enough to make each breath visible. Yet, as always, life had its way of creeping back. Milk delivered, post sorted, curtains drawn open as though nothing had changed. Miss Marple knew better. In small places, wounds never healed cleanly, They sank inward, turning to secrets again. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock returned, his overcoat flecked with the remnants of a long walk. "It's closing, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Louisa Clement will stand before the magistrate in a few days. The Crown will show leniency, no doubt. Manslaughter without intent. A tragedy, they'll call it. And the rest? Well, that will be left to memory." He hesitated, glancing toward her hearth. "And yet, something still gnaws at me. It feels unfinished." Miss Marple did not look surprised. She had been expecting those words. "Because it is unfinished, my dear Inspector," she said softly. "There is still one voice missing from the chorus of confession, the one that never spoke, but was heard all the same." Craddock frowned, taking a seat near the fire. "You mean Reverend Clement?" She nodded gently. "He has been far too quiet. It is not in a man's nature, nor a husband's, to meet ruin with such calm unless he carries a heavier burden himself. When a woman protects her husband, it is often for a reason that love alone cannot explain." Craddock leaned back, rubbing his temples. "You think he knew? About the well? The girl?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that he knew enough to keep his silence, and too much to keep his peace." That afternoon, the vicarage bell tolled 3 times, though there was no service. Reverend Clement had asked Miss Marple to call. When she arrived, he greeted her in the study, looking years older, his eyes hollow and his hands unsteady. Papers lay scattered across the desk. Sermon notes, perhaps, or something more personal. "I suppose you know," he said quietly as she entered. "Louisa has told you everything." "Almost everything," Miss Marple said. "But truth, as I've often found, has a habit of slipping between what is said and what is meant. You were kind enough to lend her your coat that night. A small gesture, perhaps, but not a careless one. Tell me, did you know where she was going?" He sank into his chair, the weight of his answer preceding his words. "I knew she meant to speak with him," he said after a long silence. "I begged her not to. Peter was fragile. I feared confrontation might undo him. But she insisted. It had become an obsession. She said the past was strangling her, that she could no longer live under the same roof with her own deceit. So I let her go. I told myself it would bring her peace." He looked up, and the raw honesty in his eyes startled even Miss Marple. When she came back that night, her hands were shaking. She said he'd fallen, that he'd simply collapsed. But there was something on her sleeve, a dark smudge like earth. And I knew. "You didn't tell the police," Miss Marple said gently. "No," he admitted, "because I thought perhaps God had chosen to close the matter himself. Peter's heart, Louisa's guilt, Mrs. Carrow's sins, it all seemed like divine arithmetic. And yet," his voice broke slightly, "it was cowardice. I called it faith to make it bearable." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sorrow. "And so you buried your own confession, Reverend, just as the Colonel's crime was buried before you. The well has always been the village's conscience, it seems. Everything unwanted ends up there." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Do you think there's forgiveness for such cowardice?" "Oh, I imagine there's forgiveness for most things," Miss Marple said softly, "but not always where we expect to find it." That evening, word spread that Reverend Clement would not preach the following Sunday. He had fallen ill, the doctor said, exhaustion of the mind and spirit. Miss Marple suspected it was something far more intimate, the collapse that follows when one's soul finally tells the truth to itself. The village, meanwhile, began its slow return to chatter. Mrs. Hartnell was already saying that poor Louisa had always seemed high-strung, while Mrs. Price Ridley had taken to claiming moral credit for having brought the truth to light. Miss Marple listened without judgment, nodding where politeness required, though her thoughts were elsewhere. A week later, she walked once more to the churchyard. The snow had begun to fall, gentle, unhurried flakes drifting across the stones. She stopped beside the old well, now covered with a new wooden lid and a small iron cross fixed upon it. Someone had placed a single white rose there. She stood quietly, her breath rising like smoke in the cold. "It's over now," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. Nothing truly ended. It merely found a quieter form. As she turned to go, she heard footsteps crunching behind her. It was Inspector Craddock, his coat buttoned high against the chill. "I suppose this is where you'll tell me what it all means," he said with a tired smile. Miss Marple looked at the well, then back at him. "It means, my dear Inspector, that truth is never buried alone. It takes a little of the living with it each time. This village will seem peaceful again soon enough, but something has changed in its soil. The ground remembers." Craddock followed her gaze, his breath misting in the cold air. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes I wish you were wrong." "So do I," Miss Marple replied. Her eyes lingered once more on the cross, then lifted toward the pale, indifferent sky. "But that's the trouble with truth. It's the only thing that doesn't forget." Together they walked back toward the lane, their footsteps fading into the hush of falling snow. Behind them, the well stood silent, sealed and still, holding within it not just the bodies and sins of the past, but the echo of every word ever left unspoken in St. Mary Mead. And as the first toll of the evening bell drifted across the village, it seemed less a call to prayer than a warning to those who still believed secrets could sleep forever. Snow continued to fall through the night, softening the corners of the village and muffling every sound. By morning, St. Mary Mead looked almost innocent again. White roofs, silver hedgerows, smoke curling quietly from chimneys. But beneath that calm lay a strange unease, the kind that lingers when justice feels too neat, too quickly settled. Miss Marple sensed it the moment she stepped outside. The air carried that peculiar stillness that follows confession, but not closure. It was, she thought, the silence of a truth only half told. At mid-morning, a knock came at her door. Inspector Craddock entered, brushing snow from his coat. "You'll think me foolish," he began, "but I can't stop thinking about something you said yesterday, that truth never buries itself alone. I thought it was over, yet there's one thing that won't leave me in peace." He placed a file on her table, his brow furrowed. The pathologist sent a final note. Linton's heart failed, yes, but there were traces of soil beneath his fingernails, and fibers caught in them. Wool, dark blue. Not from Mrs. Clement's coat, her husband's perhaps, but his was brown. And there's something else. Reverend Clement has gone missing. Miss Marple's eyes lifted sharply. "Missing?" "Didn't turn up at the vicarage this morning. The housekeeper says he left before dawn. No note, no suitcase." Craddock rubbed the back of his neck. "He's not a man built for running, but I've seen guilt drive stranger men to desperate places." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the snow falling against the window. "No, Inspector," she said at last. "Reverend Clement isn't running from guilt. He's running toward it." By noon they were back at the churchyard, the air brittle with cold. The snow had drifted against the low stone wall, and faint footprints led from the gate toward the well. Craddock followed them grimly, his breath rising in quick clouds. They stopped at the newly sealed lid, and there, beside the cross, lay a small black notebook, damp but intact. Miss Marple stooped to pick it up, brushing away the frost. The initials H.C. were pressed into the cover. She opened it carefully, and the first lines made her eyes soften with quiet sorrow. "I write this not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Louisa bore the sin that was mine. It was I who struck Peter Linton, not to kill, but to stop his voice. He had come to me that night, the letter in his hand, saying he meant to speak of the Carrows' secret from the pulpit. I saw ruin in every word he spoke. The church, my wife, our peace, it would all be undone. I reached for him, begged him to reconsider, and he fell. God forgive me, he fell. Craddock exhaled, the steam of his breath hanging in the air. So it was the vicar after all, he said quietly, and she took the blame to save him. Miss Marple turned another page. When I saw her by the fire that night, trembling, I let her believe it was her doing. Perhaps that was my greatest cowardice, not the act, but the silence that followed. I meant to confess, but I told myself the truth would help no one. Only now, with her suffering in my place, do I see what it means to kill a soul by keeping it. They stood together in the drifting snow, neither speaking. Somewhere, a distant bell tolled, its hollow sound stretching thin over the frozen fields. Craddock bent down, his voice rough. "We'll find him. He can't have gone far." Miss Marple closed the notebook and placed it gently in her coat pocket. "No," she said softly. "I think we already have." She pointed toward the line of footprints leading behind the church, disappearing into the grove of yews. They followed in silence, the path narrowing as the trees pressed close. At the edge of the grove stood the small stone bench where parishioners sometimes sat in summer. Now it was half buried under snow, and there, slumped against it, lay Reverend Clement. His coat was open, his face turned toward the sky. The stillness about him was not that of rest, but of release. Craddock knelt, checking for a pulse he already knew would not be there. "Cold as the stones," he murmured. Beside the vicar's hand lay his Bible, its pages frozen together, a single verse marked by a folded ribbon. "The truth shall make you free." Miss Marple stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "He came to finish what he had begun," she said softly. He could not bear for Louisa to stand where he should have stood, and so, in his way, he did confess, just not aloud. Craddock rose slowly, his hat in his hands. "I'll have to tell her," he said. "God knows she's been punished enough." Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on the snow falling gently over the vicar's still face. "Tell her the truth set him free," she said. "It's all she'll have left, and it may yet give her peace." By dusk, the village knew. Word traveled in whispers that softened with each retelling. The vicar's death, his confession, his wife's release. The story lost its edges, as all tragedies do when retold by those who were never inside them. To some, it became an act of redemption. To others, a final disgrace. But to Miss Marple, who watched from her window as the church bell tolled once more, it was neither. It was simply human, terribly, achingly human. She turned from the window, the room quiet except for the ticking clock. The fire burned low, casting faint light over her knitting basket. Outside, the snow had begun to cover the footprints again, erasing the last visible trace of what had been. Miss Marple took up her knitting, her hands steady now. "Poor souls," she whispered, not without gentleness. "Some truths arrive too late for the living, but perhaps just in time for the dead." The final chime of the bell drifted across St. Mary Mead, mingling with the wind, and somewhere, beneath the frozen ground where silence had once ruled, peace, fragile, imperfect, and dearly bought, finally took root. The snow melted slowly in the days that followed, leaving behind soft trails of mud that wound through the village like memories refusing to fade. The church bell, muffled for several mornings out of respect, began again, its tone low and hesitant, as if even metal could grieve. St. Mary Mead, outwardly returned to order, bore that faint, strained quiet that lingers after the unthinkable has been tidied away. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the respectful silences and the murmured condolences, the village mind was restless. It was not content with resolution. It wanted meaning, and meaning was always messier than justice. She went to the vicarage 3 days after the burial. The snowdrops had begun to pierce the thawing ground around the path, their pale heads bowed like mourners. Inside, Louisa Clement sat by the fire, a woman shrunken but not broken. Her eyes had lost the tremor of fear and now held only a deep, exhausted calm. She rose when Miss Marple entered, taking her hands with unexpected warmth. "I owe you more than I can say, Jane," she said quietly. "The inspector came this morning. They've ruled it a natural death. He said my husband died at peace." Her voice faltered on the last word as though she doubted its possibility. Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. "Peace is seldom tidy, my dear, but it is a beginning." They sat together for a long moment, the fire whispering softly between them. On the table lay Reverend Clement's Bible, now closed and worn smooth by many hands. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward it, thoughtful. "He left his truth behind him, Louisa," she said softly. "Few people are granted that grace, even at the end." Louisa smiled faintly. "Do you believe he's forgiven?" Miss Marple looked into the fire, her voice barely above a murmur. "Forgiveness, like the thaw, comes quietly. One doesn't see it until the world begins to soften again." Later, as Miss Marple walked back through the lane, she passed the churchyard, where the snow had retreated to the shadows. A fresh bouquet of primroses rested on the well's cover, bright against the grey stone. Someone had left a note tucked beneath them, sealed in glass to keep out the damp. She stooped and lifted it gently, her breath catching as she read the simple words. "For Peter, who spoke too late, but spoke the truth." There was no signature. She replaced it carefully, her heart heavy with the knowledge that even guilt had its tenderness. When she returned home, she found Inspector Craddock waiting at her gate. He looked tired, but there was a kind of release in his face. The hard lines softened, the eyes clearer. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said as she let him in. "The vicar's death has closed the file. There'll be no further inquiry." She poured him tea without comment, and he took it gratefully. "I should feel relieved," he went on, "but something about this whole affair still weighs on me. It's as though justice was done, but not cleanly. The curate dead, the vicar dead, Mrs. Clement alone, and the rest of us left wondering what it was all for." Miss Marple stirred her own cup slowly. "It was for the same reason as most things that matter, Inspector. For the truth to be known, even if it came too late to spare anyone pain. You see, human beings are very poor keepers of silence. Secrets always outlive the reasons they were kept." Craddock nodded, staring into his tea as though trying to read something in its surface. "You make it sound inevitable." "It is," Miss Marple said softly. "But inevitability doesn't make it cruel. Only human hands do that." The wind picked up outside, rattling the panes. Miss Marple turned her head slightly, listening to it. "Do you hear that?" she asked after a moment. "It's only the wind now. For months that sound carried fear through this village, but tonight it carries nothing. The air remembers, but it does not accuse." Craddock smiled faintly. "You have a poet's way of making sense of tragedy." She shook her head. "Not a poet's, Inspector. A gardener's. One must understand decay if one is to recognize new growth." He finished his tea and rose to leave, pausing by the door. "There's one more thing," he said, almost as an afterthought. "The coroner found something in the vicar's pocket, an old photograph. 3 people in a garden. Mrs. Carrow, a young maid, and Louisa herself. It must have been taken before everything began. I'll send it to her. I thought it might bring some comfort." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes," she said, "the past is rarely kind, but sometimes a picture can make it gentle again." After he left, Miss Marple stood for a long time by the window. The moonlight fell faintly over the green, silvery and still. In the distance, she could see the outline of the church, its spire pointing heavenward like a question that would never quite find its answer. She thought of Peter Linton's trembling sermon, of Louisa's quiet surrender, of the Reverend's final act of courage. All of them, in their way, had sought absolution, and all had found it only through loss. She moved to her chair, picking up her knitting, though her hands remained still. The fire crackled softly, its warmth reaching into the quiet. "There's no such thing as a perfect ending," she said aloud, as if to the empty room. "Only the mercy of understanding what one has done, and choosing to bear it." Outside, the last of the snow slipped from the church roof and fell with a muted thud. The sound was small, almost tender, like the final punctuation on a long, sorrowful sentence. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of it settle around her, and as the clock struck midnight, she whispered into the stillness, "Rest, all of you. It's finished now." But somewhere deep within her, beneath the wisdom, beneath the calm, she knew that St. Mary Mead would always carry this story in its bones. For in every quiet village, there is one truth that endures. Even buried secrets leave their roots behind, waiting for the next thaw to bring them to light once more. The spring came late to St. Mary Mead that year, as though winter had been reluctant to loosen its hold on the village that had known too much of death. The snow melted slowly, revealing crocuses pushing through the cold earth, fragile and bright, like the first stirrings of forgiveness. For weeks, the vicarage had remained shuttered. Mrs. Clement, after the funeral, had left quietly for her sister's home in Devon, leaving behind a note for Miss Marple, short, neat, and touched with the grace of a woman who had survived more truth than she had wished to know. "Thank you for helping me see what love is when it must also be penance. I'm not angry with Henry, nor with God. I'm only tired." Miss Marple read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it between the pages of her prayer book. Some things were not to be answered, only held. Life in St. Mary Mead resumed its familiar rhythm, but it had changed. The villagers spoke softly now when they passed the churchyard, and even Mrs. Price Ridley, though her gossip returned like weeds in spring, avoided any mention of the curate's death. The well remained sealed under its new cross, guarded by flowers that seemed to renew themselves every week, though no one ever saw who placed them there. Inspector Craddock came one last time to visit before the case was officially closed. He found Miss Marple in her garden, pruning the rose bushes with precise, unhurried movements. The scent of damp earth and cut stems hung in the air. "It's all settled now," he said quietly. "The bishop's appointed a new vicar, young fellow from Winchester. The parish council hopes it'll help people forget." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Forgetting is rather overrated, don't you think? The mind can bury, but the heart never quite does. It simply learns to live among ghosts." Craddock sighed, watching her hands at work. "You always manage to turn tragedy into philosophy, Miss Marple. I envy that." "It isn't philosophy," she said, clipping a branch. "It's observation. People imagine time heals, but it's really kindness that does. The vicar sought forgiveness in silence, and it killed him. Louisa sought forgiveness in truth, and it set her free. The difference is only in the courage to speak." He was quiet for a while, glancing toward the steeple that rose above the trees. "Do you think anyone will remember the curate a year from now?" "Oh, yes," she said softly. "Someone always remembers the ones who tried to do right. Perhaps not their names, but their acts. The goodness in them lingers like the scent of lilacs long after they've fallen." Craddock smiled faintly, his eyes soft with thought. "You make it sound as though nothing ever truly ends." "Does it?" Miss Marple said, turning toward him. "The vicar's sin led to confession. The curate's death led to truth. Even sorrow leads somewhere if we follow it far enough. That is the quiet mercy of the world, Inspector. It turns even its cruelties into lessons for the living." When he left, Miss Marple stood in the garden for a long while, her shears forgotten in her hand. The church bell began to toll faintly, a single line of sound carried across the breeze, neither mournful nor joyous, simply present. She thought of Reverend Clement's trembling confession, of the curate's last sermon, of the strange, intertwined fate of those who sought to keep silence and those who dared to break it. It seemed to her that the well, now silent and sealed, had ceased to be a place of burial and become instead a kind of symbol of the cost of truth, of the depth of human weakness, and of the grace that sometimes grew out of it. That evening, she sat by her fire with her knitting on her lap. The flames flickered gently, illuminating the familiar objects around her, the china teacup, the clock that ticked with reassuring stubbornness, the small photograph of the church taken before all the sorrow had come. It was quiet now. Outside, children were laughing on the green, their voices carried faintly through the open window, proof that life, indifferent and merciful, went on. She looked down at her needles, though her hands had stilled. Poor Reverend Clement, she murmured softly. Poor young Peter, and poor Louisa, left to remember them both. Yet perhaps that's what it means to live decently, to remember without bitterness. The wind brushed against the window panes like a sigh, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the fire on her face. Yes, she whispered to the quiet room. Truth may wound, but silence kills far more. When she opened her eyes again, the church clock was striking 9. She listened to its measured sound, and for the first time since it had all begun, it did not seem like morning. It sounded instead like a benediction. Outside, the night had settled over the village, calm and whole once more. Miss Marple rose, drew her curtains, and let the peace of the evening fold around her like a shawl. And so St. Mary Mead slept again beneath the same stars that had watched over every secret it had ever kept. Older, perhaps wiser, and touched by the faint, enduring glow of forgiveness. The end